friends, wherever you are. As every year in May, we are opening the Václav Havel European Dialogues. If the spring is traditionally the time of burgeoning, new beginnings and hope, the feeling is particularly poignant this year as it comes after a year of pain and gloom. There is comfort to be drawn from the fact that after a year, most of us are still here. There is deep sorrow in the realization of how many are not. At least for a few seconds of silence, we should remember those who fell victim to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. Before we start, let me express our gratitude to all the people who made this conference possible, and thanks to whom it is probably the grandest undertaking in its 8-year-old history, although virtual of necessity. Without great speakers, there is no great conference. And this year we have been blessed with the participation of 2 European heads of state, one present, one former, members of 3 successive generations of a family of Czech and Slovak and European intellectuals, leading thinkers from Germany, Britain, Bulgaria, Poland, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and one special guest whom I'm going to introduce shortly. Let me thank all those who supported this conference, our strategic sponsors, the Bakala Philanthropy, the principal sponsors of the Havel Channel, the Karel Komárek Family Foundation, the European Commission, which supports the Other Europe projects through its Europe for Citizens program, our partners in the project, the Visegrad Fund, the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic, the National Film Archives, the Institute of National Memory of Slovakia, the European Center of Solidarność of Poland, the National Széchenyi Library of Hungary, the Memorial Bautznerstraße Dresden of Germany, and all the other supporters and donors of the Václav Havel Library, big and small. Our thanks go to the Positive Group, which prepared this amazing virtual space for the conference. And my special thanks go to Zuzana Hocková, Martin Vidlák, and all my colleagues in the Václav Havel Library who have toiled for weeks to bring this conference to you. And thank you all for watching and listening. Enjoy. We have given this conference the name The Other Europe. Since the beginning, we have been aware of its twofold meaning as a trip down memory lane to the times when Europe was still divided into East and West, with those of us living in the East being the other Europe, documented at the time in a 6-part Channel 4 TV series by our colleague and friend Jacques Rupnik, and also as a shorthand for the fault lines that seem to have emerged lately in Europe, some, though not all, along the lines of the former division. But then the meaning started to multiply. We use the term Europe so often that we do not always realize we mostly use it as co-synonymous with the European Union. But there are other Europes out there which are not indifferent to us, and neither should we be indifferent to them. There is the Europe of the United Kingdom, which has left the European Union, but certainly has not sailed away from Europe itself. There is the Europe of the Southwest Balkans, which have been living in peace for some time, albeit with some of its conflicts unresolved and some of its European aspirations unfulfilled. There is the Europe of the broad band between the European Union on the one hand and Russia on the other, whose people openly cry for democracy, dignity and stability, but are hindered from getting there by dark powers, both domestic and foreign. And there is Russia itself, torn between its rulers who look back to the autocratic past and its people who hope for a better and freer future. All these are the other Europes without. If the task we set ourselves more than 30 years ago was to make Europe whole and free, we have considerable way to go. And we will hardly find the energy, the resources, and the moral legitimacy to complete the job until we have dealt with the other Europes within, big and small. They are the Europes of the past, of darkness, fear, prejudice, and intolerance. We cannot disown them, for like it or not, they are a part of us. We cannot forget them, for they are an indelible part of what Václav Havel called the memory of being. But we can transcend them and use what was valuable in our past to build our future. For the next 2 days, our discussions will revolve in one way or another around these problems. My colleague, whom I'm now going to introduce, Martina Mašková, an editor of the Czech Radio, will guide us through the proceedings as our moderator. Welcome, Martina.
I will do it with pleasure.
Thank you. But before we revisit the past today with Jacques Rupnik and the speakers of our first panel, and the present and the future tomorrow with some of the leading European thinkers, we are all in for a healthy dose of moral inspiration from someone who is a firm believer in Europe, whole and free, although he is not a European, someone who is a great leader, even though he's not a politician, a good friend to Václav Havel, the 1989 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, in an interview with Karel Kovy Kovář, the formidable young Czech influencer. Your Holiness, Kovy, the floor is yours.
Your Holiness, it's an honor of my life to meet you today, Taši Delek, or how we say in Czech, Dobrý den. You lived through so many hard challenges during your life, so my first question would be, what's the message and maybe the lesson that you learned during your lifetime? What would you say to the young generation? What would be your message?
Firstly, from childhood, you see, we learn the importance of compassion. Many years, several decades, I learned, and at a young age, these things are just knowledge. Then eventually, my life become more difficult. Then these teaching really very, very helpful. Firstly, you see, entire sentient being and at practical level, entire humanity on this planet we call mother sentient being. So you have the close feeling and sense of concern of entire humanity. Those human brothers, sisters who create a problem for you, still they are human brothers, sisters. Whether we like it or not, we have to live together, side by side. Now, in our case, like Chinese communists, you see, we suffer a lot, but still we have to live side by side. And they also basically human being, human brothers, sisters, and human good quality they also have. Their very idea of socialism very much based on oneness of entire human being, and particularly working class people. So now, sometimes you see these people, too much emphasis on ideology, and lost the very principle of democracy or socialism. So now things are changing. Things are changing. So I feel the concept oneness of 7 billion human beings, at the practical level, we have to live together on this planet.
But you talked about ideology. We live in times of increasing division. So how to be personally better in facing division, in bringing people together? How to be better in it?
In the past, we too much sort of emphasis my nation, my people. Now that thinking is gone. Now we should think entire 7 billion human being, just one human community. So now, as an entire human being on this planet, everyone wants peace, happy. No one wants quarrel, killing. So if someone at the time of birth with a weapon, then there's an exception. No one dead. You see, every human being from birth is immediately taking mother's milk and feel safe when mother carry. That's basic human nature. Now, materialistic thinking, not much thinking about these deeper human value. And on top of that, it's too much emphasis my nation or my community. At the time of birth, nobody thinking my nation like that. Eventually, so we, through education, we forget, we neglected about basic human value. But rather, you see, your nation, your religion, these things, more emphasis in education field. So I have the sort of opinion. Now, education system should include about basic human value as a secular way, not as a religious thing. So,
Yes.
Existing education system also only talk about material value, external thing, not talking about inner peace of mind. So these days, I'm talking the hygiene of physical important. That in modern education there. Now, more important, hygiene of emotion. That's very important. Now, Indian tradition, there are a lot of talks about our emotion, how to keep peace of mind. The India's 1,000-year-old tradition, the non-violence and compassion. So, over 3,000 years, this country, you see, already have the idea important to keep peace, in order to keep peace of mind, the karuna, compassion. And with that, our action, non-violence. So that I consider human good quality, not necessarily religious matter. So we can, I myself, you see, totally dedicated, promote peace of mind. I never try to propagate Buddhism or religious matter as a human being. Then different people who have different, or say, the religion, then of course, for Buddhist, I am Buddhist, it is my responsibility to explain. But my commitment is religious harmony. So in spite differences in philosophy or concept, some say there is God, some say no God, some say life after life, some say only this life. That's personal matter. But all major religious traditions carry main message is, as I mentioned earlier, loving kindness. For Christian believer, we created by God. So we are, in a way, children of God. God is infinite love. So we all children of that kind of Father. So if you accept Jesus Christ as His creation, then there is no ground to fight each other. Same Father. We all are children of that kind of Father. So that also very powerful. So in any way, I totally sort of dedicated to promote religious harmony. Then non-believer, as I mentioned earlier, human nature is a social animal. Naturally, from birth, we have the sense of concern of your own brothers, sisters. So now, something we should pay more attention is in education, modern education field. We should include education about mind, about emotion, and how to keep peace of mind.
Sure. Do you think the world would be a better place if all the politicians would know how to meditate? Would you teach them all? The world would be a better place.
Frankly speaking, old politicians are difficult to change their mind. Yes. The hope is younger generation, through education, through school, we should sort of teach how to keep peace of mind. And on that basis, you say, the concept of oneness of 7 billion human beings through education. Then these young people gradually, you see, leaders, including politicians, then there is real hope.
You met with hundreds of leaders. What were the qualities that were shared by those you admired?
Of course, in the past, like President Havel. Now that's past. Now existing, still alive, the leader, Obama. You see, he totally agree about my thinking. So we become a very close, trusted friend. And one occasion, my meeting with him, we have some discussion. Then I told him, you are younger than me. So after me, you should think you should carry about our sort of view, how to develop peace of the world and through inner peace. He promised like that. So he, and since we very close friend, one day when I met, I asked him, can we hold your ear? And he said, yes, yes. Then I hold his two ear and then had bang, bang, like that.
What did he say? Was he surprised?
He very happy like that. So as I mentioned earlier, then at the last I asked him, please carry our sort of idea after me. Please carry these. He promised like that. So he, one wonderful sort of leader like that.
Yes. You yourself are a leader. How was it for you personally? How did you handle all the responsibility that came with being a leader? Spiritual used to be political. How hard was it for you?
My background, as you know, spiritual. So 2011, I retired from political responsibility. And we already have elected political leadership. They carry this political matter. But for Tibetan people, I'm, of course, spiritual leader, or Tibetan trusted me. So morally, I'm leader. So here, regarding Tibet, the 1,000-year-old Tibetan tradition mainly come from India. The 8th century, the Nalanda master, Shantarakshita, he invited by Tibetan emperor at that time, 8th century. Then firstly, the 7th century, Tibetan first king, he married with Chinese princess, very close link. I think Buddhism introduced by Chinese Buddhists. But then sometimes I half joke, you see, he certainly loves Chinese food. But he don't like Chinese letter, too complicated. So then he decided we should develop our own script, copy from Indian Devanagari, alphabet, kakakanga, chachasanya, like that. So since then, 8th century, the Nalanda master, when he reached Tibet, he told Tibetan emperor, now since you have your own language, so now instead of study Pali or Sanskrit, you should translate these texts into Tibetan, your own Tibetan language. So now we have, since then, translation started. So now altogether about 300 volumes in Tibetan language, translated from many books in Sanskrit and number of books was there, Pali language, like that. So now here, now I found the best language to explain about logic, Buddhist logic, and Buddhist philosophy, and psychology. I found Tibetan language is the best language.
Okay. I should learn it, probably. Yes.
Yes.
Is it hard? Tibetan hard, right?
I'm very happy. You see, you as a young scholar. So if you pay more attention for learning Tibetan language, and it now 100% show the Buddhist logic, the best language is Tibetan language.
Okay.
In Chinese Buddhist language, not much mention about logic. So in Tibetan language, all those great Indian master, logician, great master, they are writing most part translated into Tibetan. So now today, Tibetan who study these, their sort of mind more, sophisticated, like that. And then also in Tibetan language, what call dialectic. Tibetan language in dialectic is something very familiar. Through that way, so now the Nalanda tradition always emphasizes investigation. In order to investigation, the dialectical language is very essential, very important. So sometimes, sometimes I jokingly, you see, telling my friend, the Buddhist monk from Pali tradition, I jokingly telling them, your tradition is foundation of Buddha Dharma. Oh, wonderful, but you have no teeth. If some difficult subject come, then you said you should, there's no way to choose, just like that. So since we study logical approach, so no matter how difficult subject, we can bite, like that. So therefore, today I found as far as dialectical way to explain Buddhist philosophy, Tibetan language is the best language, I noticed, like that. So we, as a refugee, we lost our own country. Quite a big number Tibetan in India as a refugee. Now we consider importance of re-establish those ancient Tibetan big monastery. You see, they usually have, in order to become scholar in Tibet, at least 20, 30 years study. So that tradition we re-establish in India. So we have about, I think, about 10,000 monk students. Now they still carry this tradition, logical approach. The Nalanda tradition, even using Buddha's own word, we raise question, why Buddha says that? Investigate. So if through investigation, Buddha's own word, if you find some contradiction, we have the right to reject. That's Nalanda tradition. Many Nalanda master, you see, even some Buddha's word, they reject. So that's, I think, wonderful. So always emphasis logical approach through reasoning, like that.
Let me pivot a little bit, because topic of our conference is European Union. So I would like to ask you if after many decades that it exists, do you still see what is the reason for existence of European Union, and why is it important nowadays?
I always say, admire the spirit of European Union. They, like French, German, in past many occasions fighting, killing each other. Then that very two nations, after Second World War, Adenauer, Germany, de Gaulle, French, now they develop the spirit of European Union. Since they established European Union, mainly, you see, carried by French and Germany, previously arch enemy. So, spirit of European Union, I really admire. So, now, because European Union developed, since then, no longer any killing among the members of European Union. Now, the spirit of European Union and should spread to Africa, Latin America, and Arab countries, some kind of union. That's the best way guarantee for peace. So I always express that I really admire the spirit of European Union. If European Union not develop, then last a few decades, some killing among the members of European Union. Now completely peace. So now that spirit eventually should develop entire world, some kind of union. Then we can really develop no longer military forces. Truly peaceful world. So I'm hoping, so now younger generation, their thinking is more open. I think including you, thinking more open. The older people, a little bit stubborn.
We have some of them here, so just they, you know.
So the reality much change. So old thinking, too much emphasis my nation or my community is outdated. Now, according to reality, we should think about humanity on the basis of oneness of 7 billion human beings. So, I think younger generation, now they can think according new reality. Old people, sometimes it's difficult to accept a new reality. They're still thinking old thinking like that. Now, like United Nations and the European Union, I think can make some contribution regarding the concept of oneness of 7 billion human beings and work together.
But these topics like humanity and oneness of all or climate change are sometimes overshadowed by topics like money and economics. Many politicians seem to care more about money than anything else. My question is, how we can effectively beat money by topics like humanity or climate change? Is there any way?
Now, as I mentioned earlier, hygiene of physical, the material life, mainly concerned about hygiene of physical. Now that's not sufficient. Now we have this emotion, so we should pay more attention about the hygiene of emotion. For that, not through prayer, not through religious belief, but through education and mainly a scientific sort of explanation how to keep peace of mind. That. So, I think future generation, I'm hopeful. You see, new way of thinking. Then on top of that, one problem, global warming. Or some expert say now within few decades, the global warming reach such a sort of level, the most river will dry. So very serious matter. And Tibet, an Asian continent, the source of water, most rivers which cover China, Vietnam, and these Indonesian, and then India, these big river, now within my own lifetime in Tibet, these level of these river reducing. So now, next few decades, it is quite serious. So eventually, Tibet will be some kind of desert land. Then, many, I think, over a billion human population, their life depends those rivers which come from Tibet. Then become very difficult. So now, we have to think, we have to accept our whole world. Now, eventually, towards the ending of this planet. So, while we alive, much better live together with spirit of brotherhood, sisterhood. So now no longer thinking too much emphasis, we and they, and spend a lot of money for weapon. That's now short-sighted, like that.
Your Holiness, since coming into exile, millions of people, both young and old, have listened to your words. It helped them, and they benefited from your teachings. So my question is, will there be a next Dalai Lama? And if not, who will continue in your work?
Dalai Lama Institution since some time back, this institution, you see, developed, and you see, then I think fifth Dalai Lama, then this institution is a political power as well as spiritual leader. Now political power, as I mentioned earlier, I already sort of retired. So now it is, it is not right. The rich tradition like Buddhism, Nalanda tradition, Buddhism, depend on one individual person is wrong. Now, institution, as I mentioned earlier, in India, we already have big monastic institution. They carry this knowledge. In Tibet also, you see, number of monastery in some remote area. In Lhasa area, not much, too much sort of control and restriction. But some remote area, thousands Tibetan still study, practice. So Tibetan spirit, based on this Nalanda tradition, very strong. So Tibetan people, really, I think Buddhist faith, Buddhist spirit, much stronger than communism. When I met Chairman Mao Zedong, one occasion, he mentioned to me, your mind, very scientific mind, so religion is opium. Chairman Mao Zedong told me like that. But now, time passes, now number of Chinese communists, you see, their mind, you see, much closer to Buddhism than Marxism. So now time passes, I think in Tibet and also in China and Mongolia, I think Buddhism will grow. Buddhist faith will grow. The communist ideology, I think communist ideology, very good. When I was in China, I was in Peking, I want to join Communist Party. I love the socialism and working class people, special sort of effort for right of working class people. Wonderful. So now, China, as I briefly mentioned, number of Chinese, including many Chinese communists, in deep inside Buddhist faith. Now things are changing. Buddhism in general, particularly Nalanda tradition, is a very scientific religion. So next, I think 1 century, I think new thinking definitely come. And then communism, totalitarian system, no future. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, great future.
Let's hope for that. Your Holiness, it's been a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an inspiration to hear about Europe from a nation religious leader. What an idea to teach politicians to meditate. What if he did it? Imagine. The nation of Tibet is still not free, and we will now explore the situation of Europe, Central Europe, which was not free at the time of communism, at the end of the 80s. Opposition leaders were still in jail or persecuted. Many people could not go to further education. And at that time, British Channel 4 broadcasted the Other Europe series, which is the basis of today's discussion. So let us inspire and hear what Jacques Rupnik says, who is the author, creator, and guide through the series, who is a political scientist and publicist.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody, dear friends and colleagues. Let me, before I begin, pay tribute to the memory of Ivan Havel. Before I got to know him in person, he had organized in Prague at the end of 1988 the first private viewing of The Other Europe. So, yeah, remembering him, well, is not only a personal duty, I would say, but also is connected to our subject. He was the first Czech viewer of the film. The Other Europe documentary project was conceived in a divided Europe before 1989. It took 2 years, entailed 100 of interviews, which, with the whole archive, have now been transferred to Prague to the Václav Havel Library. The film was completed a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was, so to speak, the landscape before the battle. None of us, none of the great minds we then interviewed had a clue about its imminent collapse. So it is, among other things, a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of history. Václav Havel used to say, I find people who claim to understand the laws of history eminently suspicious. Let me say a few words to introduce our discussion today, which will be continued tomorrow. First, what was The Other Europe and what's behind its title? Why the documentary evidence, and especially the interviews, may be relevant today and help us understand the past in our present. And finally, can it help us deal with and hopefully overcome some of our current divides, misperceptions, misunderstanding, not just about the past, but about the present state of Europe? The starting point of the Other Europe project in the mid-1980s was the following. There was a new important cultural and political developments in East Central Europe related to the dissident movements, but by no means confined to them, which we thought were of great relevance to West Europeans. Yet the prime focus of attention in the media and the political circles at the time was on the Gorbachev moment, the perestroika reforms, and Gorbachev's call for a common European house. So our idea was to shift the focus from Moscow to Central Europe, from the so-called actually existing socialism to the cracks in the actually existing dictatorships. Therefore, in the interviews conducted in Central Europe, we focus on three related themes: the emergence of dissent as signaling the rebirth of civil society, and human rights movements as the rehabilitation of the language of rights and the call for the respect of the rule of law. Both aspects are clearly related to the shaping of the post-89 democracies. Secondly, we explored the independent culture, the way it was challenging existing taboos, extending the possibilities of freedom, and reflected a shared Central European predicament. Last but not least, beyond the decay of the communist system, its ideology and economy, there was the erosion of the Soviet Empire, especially on its Western periphery. We wanted Western audiences to listen to unfamiliar voices. When you listen to the leading intellectual figures of the time, Havel, Šimečka, Konrad, Geremek, Kuroň, you understand the shift in the perception of the region. It was seen as the West of the East for a long time. It was becoming by then the East of the West. That was the goal, and we tried to give a perspective on a divided Europe from within Central Europe. So the first panel of our conference, with some of those who were interviewed back then, should allow us to ask them how they see the legacies of that period from the perspective of today, 30 years on. Some may ask, what's the point of recalling pre-1989? Times have changed. Let us discuss our present-day challenges and look to the future. There are, it seems to me, at least two good reasons why it may be worse to make these interviews available again, revisit their lines of questioning, rather than just letting the archive collect dust in a museum. One is that we live in times dominated by the tyranny of immediacy. Instant, permanent news flows known as infotainment, which contribute to a form of amnesia, or at least to a considerable ignorance about our recent past. Especially for the younger generation, this tends to be a faraway past of which we know little. Yet at the same time, we live in the midst of a variety of memory wars, where statues are being brought down and new narratives being promoted. So our goal here is hopefully to contribute to an informed public debate about the past and highlight the interplay between individual and collective memories as they have developed since 1989. I can think of no better way to approach these issues and the generational differences they reveal than our second panel, which could be called the Šimečka Family Reunion, or more adequately, a dialogue of three generations of Šimečkas. I happen to have the privilege to have known all three and will never forget my meeting with Milan Šimečka Sr., our interview in Václav Havel's flat almost 2 years before the Velvet Revolution. He's greatly missed, and I really look forward to hearing the Šimečkas present among us, their reflections about the legacies and memories of the past in our present. The second, no less important reason has perhaps more political implications, especially the younger generation. I can see it with my students. It tends to take a free and open Europe project for granted. It may be useful to reflect on 30 years of convergence and unification of our continent at a time when we read headlines in our newspapers concerning democratic backsliding in Central Europe, the resurgence of nationalism, and outright skepticism about the project of European integration. A question often posed in Western Europe is, are we witnessing a return of a new East-West divide in Europe? It concerns primarily, but not exclusively, the rule of law and free media, which are the very foundations of liberal democracy. It concerns also several societal issues, ranging from the position of women in society to multiculturalism, or if you wish, societal liberalism. Indeed, the rejection of societal liberalism is used as a justification for the rejection of political liberalism. In short, what is at stake here is not about the political complexion of a given government, but about shared values, principles, and institutions. There is a great panel devoted to these questions tomorrow, and I do not wish to preempt that discussion. I just want to highlight the connection with the other Europe. Hungary in the late 1980s was a relatively most open of the East European countries in terms of its borders and free speech. That was, I think, unquestionable. Today, the border is protected by a fence and independent media are being shut down. Poland witnessed the strongest social movement known as Solidarność, associated with the name of Lech Wałęsa, who will be joining us shortly. Today, Solidarność is better known as a museum to which the government claims to control the appointments. The pre-1989 part of the political struggle. Meanwhile, Adam Michnik, the veteran dissident and editor of Gazeta, writes op-eds in West European papers about the threats to press freedom in his country. Who would have imagined that 30 years ago? So, how did we get from there to here? That will be the underlying theme of this year's European Dialogues. To conclude, before 1989, when we presented the film to Western audiences, I could sum up the situation as follows. There was in Western Europe rather poor knowledge of the realities of East Central Europe, but there was a growing curiosity and interest. And with the other Europe, we were trying to bridge the two. Today, there is undoubtedly much better knowledge. People travel, there is a constant flow of news, but there is perhaps less interest. As if we lost interest in each other once our common problem, that is, the Soviet Empire and the division of Europe, had been overcome. West Europeans discover that present-day discourse on Europe in Budapest or Warsaw does not correspond to their simplified image of East Europeans belatedly embracing Western understanding of liberal democracy. And conversely, the image of Western Europe in Central Europe does not fit the one of pre-1989 either. Central Europeans discovered that Western Europe had changed since 1968, let alone since 1989. The present does not correspond to the image they had kept or constructed in a divided Europe before 1989. Hence, a mutual disappointment and sometimes mutual recriminations. The Other Europe project was meant to dispel stereotypes and misperceptions about Central Europe. Revisiting its legacy may, albeit modestly, help better understand and hopefully correct those of today. That is what the Václav Havel European Dialogues are about. Thank you for your attention.
So we are exploring landscape before the battle, as Jacques Rupnik said a few minutes ago. I really like this mentioning of the situation at the end of the 80s, which was very different from what we live today. But he mentioned a lot of details which link that era, maybe, to current situation. You will hear a mixture of interviews. Some of them are pre-recorded, some of them will be live. We will have live interview with Jacques Rupnik come back after a while, and we will hear another person who really participated, who was interviewed at that era when the Other Europe series was created. We will start with Poland. Jacques Rupnik mentioned Poland already. And we will start with the interview, which is from the original material of Jacques Rupnik. Lech Wałęsa. You know that Lech Wałęsa was a president of Poland after 1989 era, but this interview is done at the period when he was the leader of Solidarność Trade Union, and after he got a Nobel Peace Prize. He was already a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, but he didn't know that the Iron Curtain would fall in a few years. So Lech Walesa has a flaw.
Pierwszy etap tej reformy, która nazywała się Solidarnością, był bardzo widowiskowy, bardzo emocjonalny. I z tego etapu nas znają miliony ludzi w Polsce i na świecie. Niemniej jednak, jak tak się zastanowimy głębiej, to ten etap był poza emocją, nie zostawiał tak wielkich jakichś trwałych śladów. Natomiast drugi etap, w którym się znajdujemy, jest etapem, który zbiera te wszystkie emocje i próbuje ustawić je w programy pozytywne, realizacyjne. I tu właśnie rozgrywa się batalia o zwycięstwo tamtych dni i zwycięstwo idące w przyszłość. Jeśli tak postawimy pytanie, wtedy możemy dyskutować o Solidarności, co jest dzisiaj, co nas czeka, w jakim miejscu jesteśmy i dokąd zmierzamy.
And Lech Walesa was interviewed again for this reason, for this conference of today. And he was asked, what do you perceive to be the most important moment in the history of solidarity? And what do you perceive to be the biggest achievement of Solidarność?
Otóż doszliśmy coraz bardziej, świat dochodził do wniosku, że ten podział powojenny, ten podział blok jeden i drugi, który szykuje się do wojny atomowej, bo ten podział jest niedobry. I że technologia wymaga, abyśmy jednak znosili bariery i granice, byśmy się otwierali, bo technologia, no jak mówię, nie mieści się w tych. I dlatego też do tego trzeba było dojrzeć, do tego trzeba było dopasować myślenie, a też i zauważyć, że to technologia wymusza od nas powiększenie struktur, a tamte bariery hamują rozwój świata. Problem polega na tym, że wyjście z tamtego wielkiego podziału, gdzie były różne interesy i ambicje polityków, no było skomplikowane i trudne. I dlatego patrząc nawet na Polskę, kiedy nam narzucili po wojnie ten system, to lata 40-50 walczyliśmy z bronią w ręku. Przegraliśmy tą walkę, potem lata 60-70 robiliśmy strajki, demonstracje, wchodziliśmy na ulicę. Przegraliśmy też ten etap walki, ale wyciągając wnioski z prób i błędów, doszliśmy do pomysłu: zbudujmy Solidarność. Zbudujmy i trzymajmy się zakładów pracy, bo tutaj przeciwnicy mają trudniej nas trafić. Więc dobra organizacja między zakładami i łączności, i nawet jeśli nas wyniosą z zakładów, to po jakimś czasie musimy wrócić, bo praca musi być i znów zrobimy to samo. I dlatego też nauczyliśmy się metod walki. Wcześniej tego nie można było zbudować, musieliśmy dochodzić po każdym jakimś momencie skomplikowania, musieliśmy dochodzić do następnej formy walki. Ja uczestniczyłem w łańcuchu zdarzeń i prawie wszystkie elementy tego łańcucha tworzą łańcuch. Jakby wyjmę jeden, a powiem, że jest ładniejszy czy lepszy, no to nie ma łańcucha. Otóż trzeba zawsze zrozumieć czasy, które mają swoją specyfikę. Tamte czasy trzymano nas krótko, nie było wolności, nie było demokracji, była bezpieka, więc moje zadanie było nie mówić o tym, ale budzić narody do dyskusji, budzić społeczeństwo, rozdawać wolność, pokazywać, że to jest lepsze, nie bójcie się wreszcie i tak dalej. A więc podburzałem i cieszyłem się, że podburzają, bo to powoduje zaangażowanie społeczne i dyskusję. I wiedziałem, że czym dłużej będziemy trwać w tym, tym będzie gorzej nas zwalczać. A znów nie mówię, ja nie mogłem o tym mówić, ja musiałem to robić. I mi się udało, A to, że znów nie mogłem się tłumaczyć, to było to podejrzane. Właśnie, ja miałem straszną sytuację. I w związku z tym wszystko tu było ważne, tylko trzeba rozumieć, po co to było, czemu to służyło. Po komunizmie, po trzymaniu, po tym zamordyzmie trzeba było obudzić naród, trzeba było wyrwać go ze strachu do działania i przez działanie osiągać przesunięcie się w kierunku wolności. Ale znów dzisiaj, dzisiaj to dlatego tak daleko zwyciężyliśmy, że dzisiaj trzeba to wszystko inaczej ustawić, bo przecież demokracja to ma inne założenia ma demokracja. Demokracja ma założenia, że najlepsi, najbardziej porządni, przez wszystkich pilnowani, najlepsi zwyciężają. A czy tak jest? Że to mafia, to przecież to jesteśmy źle wychowani. No, bo dlatego, że jesteśmy wychowani dla starej epoki, a teraz nam przyszło nową budować, dlatego trzeba prawie wszystko przerobić, bo nie pasuje do tej epoki. Pytanie jest, to jest tak ogrom spraw, że wielu nie wierzy, że to jest możliwe, że jednak nie damy rady, że jednak będziemy rozbijać się. Przyszło nam żyć w momencie, kiedy zmieniają się epoki. Technologię zbudowaliśmy w tym czasie, która nie mieści się w tych naszych państewkach, w tamtym zorganizowaniu, krótko mówiąc. I dlatego musimy powiększyć struktury, a powiększając struktury musimy zmienić też i programy. I natknęliśmy się na trzy wielkie problemy i pytania. Na tej drodze wielkiej dyskusji, jak ten świat ma na dziś wyglądać. Pierwsze pytanie jest, jaki fundament proponujemy pod tą nowość po upadku komunizmu, po upadku tamtego zorganizowania. Bloki, państwa, granice, kontynenty. I to jest czas wielkiej dyskusji. Dlatego, że nikt właściwie po tej starej epoce, która nie była tak do końca czysta, wojny, rewolucje, bijatyki, nieuczciwe postępowanie państw między sobą, nikt nikomu na dzisiaj tak bardzo nie wierzy. Musimy to wszystko wydyskutować. Pierwsze pytanie już powiedziałem. Jaki fundament proponujemy pod tą nowość, którą musimy zacząć budować? I tu pojawiają się dwie koncepcje. Jedna koncepcja mówi, budujmy na wolnościach, wolnym rynku i prawie. I połowa ludzkości tak mniej więcej myśli, a druga połowa mówi nie. Po doświadczeniach przeszłości, po doświadczeniach historycznych powinniśmy uzgodnić wartości i dopiero wolny rynek i prawo. Na razie, jak mówię, 50/50, nie możemy wyskoczyć z tego, którą koncepcję wybieramy. Jakby się nam już udało wydyskutować, którą koncepcję bierzemy na to nowe budowanie, to wtedy będzie drugie pytanie, a jaki system ekonomiczny pasowałby do tej epoki? Na pewno nie komunizm, dlatego że nigdzie w świecie się nie sprawdził. Więc odrzucamy. Ale też nie taki kapitalizm, który był niezły, ale w tym układzie podziałów bloki, kraje, państwa, to tam wtedy była taka rywalizacja, wyścig szczurów, ktoś nazwał tamtą epokę. Jeśli teraz budujemy w interesie nas wszystkich większe zorganizowanie, a więc kontynenty, a nawet globalizację, no to koniec wyścigu szczurów, bo interes jest nasz wszystkich. Na pewno zostaje wolny rynek z tamtego systemu, natomiast wszystko inne musimy pozmieniać, dopasować do tych czasów. I trzeci problem, który staje w tym czasie dla nas wszystkich, to jest jak poradzić sobie z demagogią, populizmem i nieuczciwością polityków w tej skali większej. Pamiętając o tym, że ta stara epoka jednak trzymała społeczeństwa w jakimś wierzeniu, jakiegoś Pana Boga, różnego, ale tak społeczeństwa miały coś takiego. I jednocześnie też obawialiśmy się sąsiadów, komunizmu i to wszystko jednak trochę masy trzymało w jakichś ryzach. To wszystko odpadło i teraz musimy wymyśleć coś, co będzie no jednak dyscyplinowało będzie ostrzegało, czy zwracało uwagę, że nie za daleko, nie? I tak dalej. I dlatego też cały czas od upadku komunizmu, do którego przyczyniła się Solidarność, cały czas jesteśmy w epoce dyskusji, jak ten świat ma wyglądać po tamtym zwycięstwie. Solidarność, wracając do Solidarności, trzeba rozumieć tak, że to było budowanie monopolu przeciwko monopolowi starego porządku, komunizmowi i w ogóle. I w tym chęci budowania monopolu mieliśmy wspólny fundament. I to był komunizm, Związek Sowiecki. Różny stosunek był do tego układu. Jedni kochali Związek Radziecki i komunizm, inni nie, ale to wszystko było wspólne. I przeciwnicy, i zwolennicy, ale jednak trzymaliśmy się na tym fundamencie tamtych obaw i struktur. Jak to upadło, no to też upada filozofia tamtej walki. Nie mamy wspólnego mianownika i stąd, dopóki nie wymyślimy coś, co będzie nas tak daleko łączyć, jak wtedy te zagrożenia i tamte problemy, to będziemy tęsknić do Solidarności, ale jednocześnie rozsądni muszą wiedzieć, że to jest niemożliwe jak w tych warunkach. Solidarność była dobra, wspaniała, ale na te czasy przy tych zagrożeniach i w ogóle.
So Lech Wałęsa, after more than 30 years, expressed his views on not just solidarity movement from today's perspective, but also he spoke about the need of a new common ground. And as His Holiness Dalai Lama mentioned in the beginning, if you remember his first speech, he spoke about the need of unity between the humanity, and Lech Wałęsa is speaking about the invention of something that would be able to unite us as much as the old fears. So we had the opportunity to listen to the Polish perspective, and now we will hear a representative of Hungarian political system, not especially after the revolution, after the fall of Iron Curtain, but he was a writer at the time of communism, at the end of the 80s. You will listen to György Konrád, who was a novelist, who was an essayist, also a Holocaust survivor, Hungarian writer who died in 2019. So you will hear the interview which Jacques Rupnik recorded at the end of the 80s.
What does the partition of Europe mean to you and to people here?
You know, there are two parts of Europe. One is more lucky than the other. I'm living in the part which is not so lucky. So I'm not so pleased by this partition, because I am, with a lot of people who are living here, the loser. And the loser is never satisfied with the status quo. Probably the superpowers are more satisfied, maybe also the western part of Europe is also satisfied, but somehow the East Europeans aren't happy with their situation. And it's, yes, maybe also a factor of the destabilization, because somehow it shows that this problem is not arranged, that it's an anomaly which became a normality. And this normality is accepted because it was the consequence of the forces, but probably a situation which was constructed after the war on the ruins of Europe, where the European nations were somehow physically and morally also destroyed. So a structure which was built on this terrain of ruins is not so valid and meaningful as it was immediately after the war.
So György Konrad, recorded by Jacques Rupnik, and we have the opportunity to listen to Jacques Rupnik live. Welcome again.
Hello again.
I hope you can hear us well, so that I can ask you a first question.
Yes, I hear you. I hear you well.
When you listen to the interview of György Konrad, after so many years, after more than 30 years, what were you thinking about? What the situation of Hungary was at the time, and how you perceive it from today's perspective?
Well, first of all, it's very touching, very moving to see György Konrad as he was then. This was recorded at the beginning of 1988. We didn't have a clue this division of Europe would end, but you can see from the tone of his voice that he is not there just to complain how terrible life is and how unbearable this division. No, he is taking a rather detached posture, saying, well, after the war, Europe has been divided, and there is a Western Europe and there is Eastern Europe. There is a happier part of Europe, and we are the unhappy part of Europe, which is a rather polite or humorous way of putting it, considering all we know about the communist regimes. And what he seems to suggest is that, of course, given that situation, the status quo divided was easier to accept West Europeans for obvious reasons. They may regret it. They may say, "Oh, this is too bad for Eastern Europe." But at the end of the day, they can more or less accept it. But he says, for us on the receiving end of this divide in Eastern Europe, this is much more difficult. This is not an acceptable, lasting problem, and therefore the rest of the view and the whole discussion then had in around two things. In the time, which an attempt to reform the economy, introduce market reforms. They even they opened the stock market, or some kind of would-be stock market, privatization of some sectors of the economy, an attempt of the regime to loosen up and to reform the economy. And then there was of the society to take up initiatives. And of course, György Konrad, a writer, was very much involved in the samizdat, in the self-publishing, independent publishing that was taking place. It was the range of authors that were involved was very interesting. But what he would say is, I used to make any compromises. But for most people then, most writers, if they refrain from talking about the Soviet Union, if they do not mention 1956 revolution, if they avoid mentioning the word Tadar, the then leader of the Communist Party, they can more or less publish. So there was something like a decaying compromise between the state and society. I'm mentioning this because, of course, this is a sharp contrast to what we see today in Hungary. So Hungary was the most, relatively, in relative terms, the most open of the Soviet bloc regimes. People could travel. People like György Konrad could come to do an interview with me totally relaxed and go home after, which was a contrast with doing an interview with Václav Havel, which we had to arrange, and we didn't know how it would go, whether we would be allowed to do it. So these were different situations then. And for me, the striking contrast between the Hungary as it was on the eve of change and Hungary as it was in the early days of change, the most promising country in terms of democratic transition, rule of law, they were the first to, adopt all the Western standards very quickly, and it seemed to have a broad consensus. And if you look at the situation today, we witness a formidable regression. And so this is the contrast. The rule of law is being undermined, independent writing, and especially the media. I'm sure tomorrow this question will crop up in the discussion in the afternoon. But when you consider the relative freedom we had in some of the Hungarian media, in some of the publishing, and in personal encounters like we had with Konrad, and the restrictions that are now being imposed in Hungary 30 years after, I think this is a cruel irony and a rather sad comment about how far we've gone in 30 years.
We have already a vivid online interaction, and there are many questions, like more general, which explore this contrast you mentioned between the old world and the current situation, which we see not just in Hungary. So let me ask you one of the questions which emerged already. For centuries, Germany and Russia have been the mortal enemies of Poland. The EU reconciled Poles and Germans. Reconciliation between Poland and Russia is a matter of the future of Europe, isn't it? Question to Jacques Rupnik again.
Well, that's a tough question. I wish you could ask that one to Lech Wałęsa. I think the Polish German reconciliation started when William came to Warsaw, he kneeled and paid homage to those part in the Warsaw insurrection during the war. So there was an attempt at reconciliation and politically. And then, of course, or liberation could take place within the framework of the European Union. So you have a process of within which that dialogue can go on. That doesn't mean they have the about what happened, about that conflict story, but they can come together. You can have a dialogue. Whereas with Russia, this is another proposition. They were attempting to make such a dialogue with Russia, and there was even a moment when I thought this would be possible. When I saw that Andrzej Wajda's film called Katyn, which is a formidable film about the massacre of Polish officers by the Soviet secret police. That was shown on Russian television in prime time. The film starts with a bridge and people running on the bridge from both sides. And they are the ones who saying, don't go this way, the Germans are coming behind. And the others are saying, oh, don't go this way, the Russians are coming. And this, of course, was a symbolic presentation of what happened in 1939 when the country was being sort of divided or taken over from both sides. So to show something like that on Russian television in prime time, and this was only 10 years ago or 10, 12 years ago. So I thought then such a reconciliation could take place. Well, we now see that Russian policy in its neighborhoods, in the Ukraine, the rhetoric, the vehement nationalist rhetoric. I don't have to explain to a Czech audience the recent context about Russian behavior in the countries which it used to occupy. And I think, therefore, we don't have the will to have such a dialogue like with Poles and Germans, and we don't have the framework to do it. So if you don't have the political will and the framework, all you can do is to draw the line and wait for better circumstances to restart a process, because at some point it will have to happen.
we have public from different countries of Europe, Germany included, as I know. So it's I think, a very good idea to pass to the German perspective. We will hear Jacques Rupnik again. Thank you for this moment. And we will listen to one of the German leaders. Lutz Rathenau is an artist. He was a freelance writer at the time of communism, at the end of the 80s, when Jacques Rupnik recorded his interview with him. And after 1989, he became a legislator in Saxony and the representative for the Stasi files. As you remember, probably, Stasi was a secret communist police in East Germany before 1989. So Lutz Rathenau from Saxony speaks 30 years before.
You've written a book about East Berlin, but when you talk about Berlin, you talk about one city. What is the image of the other half for an East Berliner?
Die andere Hälfte ist eine sehr seltsame Stadt. Für mich ist ein Teil dieser Stadt und doch eine eigene Stadt. Eine Stadt, von der ich viel höre im Radio. Ich höre Radiosender aus Westberlin. Ich habe viele Freunde dort, sie besuchen mich, aber ich kann nicht dorthin fahren. Ich höre sehr viel, ich habe viele Informationen. Und das ist beides. Es ist noch eins für mich und es sind zwei verschiedene Dinge. Zwei Hälften, die mehr als das ehemalige Ganze ergeben.
So this is Lutz Rathenau interview at the end of the 80s. And Lutz Rathenau was asked again for the purpose of our conference. And the questions were the following. I will read them. The divided Berlin has been a symbol for the divided Europe for decades. Today, it is one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. Do you think that today's Europe comes closer to divided Berlin again? Or has Berlin overtaken the once divided Europe and the marks left by the Iron Curtain on both sides of the wall overcome? The second question was, it is possible today to speak of a different Europe? Europe East speak of Berlin? Or have new dividing lines developed, and where do you think they run? And the third question was, what can we do today on both sides to help the other, Eastern Europe, understand?
Berlin hat Europa überholt und hat Spuren der Teilung überwunden, indem sie diese auch zeigen kann, indem sie diese in Gedenkorten verschiedener Art auch vorführt und sich damit ziemlich souverän seiner Vergangenheit stellt. Berlin unterläuft wie alle Metropolen einer Gefahr, dass es sich zu sehr als Raumschiff von seiner Umgebung abhängen kann. Also in Europa gibt es schon neue nationale Grenzen, Interessenlagen, den Unterschied Stadt, Land, Großstadt, Kleinststadt und Regionen, die neue Misstrauensmauern aufbauen. Und diese Zentren wie Berlin, hoffentlich Prag, Warschau und andere Städte wirken dem entgegen. Die Frage ist, ob sie alle Menschen aus dem Land noch mitnehmen. Ich finde, dass die alten Trennlinien so einfach nicht in der Gegenwart zu finden und vor allen Dingen nicht für die Zukunft vorzuschreiben sind. Der Ost-West-Unterschied ist in dieser Reihenform nicht mehr da. Es war immer manches in Polen, in Ungarn und anderen Ländern westlicher als bestimmte Bereiche auch in Westeuropa. Und heute gibt es schon einen Nord-Süd-Unterschied. Es gibt ländliche Regionen, großstädtische Region. Und dann müsste man über den Osten reden. Was ist der Osten? Wo fängt er an? Wo hört er auf? Da wäre dann über Russland und Europa schon energisch nachzudenken, in einer sehr differenzierten und möglichst genauen Art und Weise. Ich glaube, wir können auf beiden Seiten was ganz Einfaches tun, vielleicht jetzt etwas egoistisch gesagt, wir können die Literatur der anderen Seite lesen, wir können die Kunst, auch im Lockdown, betrachten, wir können versuchen, uns in die Geschichte und ihre Auswirkungen der Gegenwart genau hineinzuversetzen. Das ist ein bisschen anstrengend. Man sollte die Neugier darauf ankurbeln, dass man die Menschen besser versteht, dass sie mitunter auch verschiedene Vorstellungen haben von Entfaltungsmöglichkeiten. Und die Freiheiten, die wir zum Glück haben, müssen Freiheiten sein, die für möglichst viele Leute da sind. Und wenn sich Europa zu sehr als Festung nur fühlt und ausbauen will, würde es auf Dauer nicht als kosmopolitischer Ort funktionieren und man würde auch selbst, glaube ich, das Interesse an sich verlieren. Und für die Ostdeutschen und für die Ostberliner ist es für mich ganz interessant, dass die Leute am besten mit der Gegenwart klarkommen, am meisten Impulse in die Gesellschaft hineingeben, die auch auf den Westen neugierig sind. Also auch auf sich selbst. Also ich glaube, man muss auch auf sich selbst neugierig sein können, um den anderen und nicht nur Osteuropa gut zu begegnen.
Lutz Rathenau from Saxony, who, in order to make his texts accessible to the public before 1999, he used reading events in church institutions or private home. Imagine how difficult it was. And we will have an opportunity to speak about a situation, a similar situation in the 80s, from the perspective of another participant of the Other Europe interviews. It's Mr. Jan Krčmář, who is live with us from Vienna. Welcome in this discussion.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I will just briefly introduce you before we will hear what you what Jacques Rupnik recorded with you more than 30 years ago. So Jan was a son of a Czechoslovak diplomat, born in Cologne, studied in London. In the 50s, the communists in the Czechoslovakia repeatedly denied his admission to further studies. He worked manually on construction of roadways and railway, on assembly of military planes. And in the 60s, he could earn a living as an interpreter and translator, later as an editor of Czechoslovak press agency. Before we listen to what you said to Jacques Rupnik, Jan, could you tell us what was the situation just before you left? You were forced to leave Czechoslovakia, am I right?
Yes, we were forced. We got a letter from the Minister of the Interior, Mr. Obdina, where he advised us to apply for an immigration passport and relinquish our citizenship. And he promised us that if we applied, our application would be very favorably reviewed, and he advised us to accept this chance of moving out. And that was sort of really one thing that you don't refuse, at least not in those circumstances.
happily who could work for Reuters agency as a reporter until 1998. So you witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall and many important events in the 90s. But now we will hear another situation. You were interviewed by Jacques Rupnik and his colleagues in 1988. And you were talking about the monetary reform. You were asked that if you could give one example of something you were told that no one believed that was part of the Communist Party's ideology.
Could you give us one example of something you were told that no one believed, part of the party ideology?
Yes, for instance, I mean, there was the great case of the monetary reform of 1953, where there was a panic because the party bosses or the people inside the party knew there was going to be a reform, and they in fact started a buying spree, which then spread because everybody then began to know about it. At the same time, you had the party bosses in the factory, or the factory managers would call meetings and assure the workers that there was not going to be a monetary reform, that everything was fine, but people, A, didn't believe them, that they went on buying. Secondly, about a month later it happened, so that that was one of the total sort of emptinesses of phrases.
What was the effect on people's savings of the reform?
The effect there was that people practically lost everything. Up to a certain amount, which was very small, you got 1 to 5. Above that, it was a rate of 1 to 50, old crowns for new crowns. And of course, a lot of people who had maybe saved a lot of money before that were afraid of taking all their money to be changed because they would be asked questions of where they'd got the money before, so that many people lost everything.
So Jan Krčmář, more than 30 years ago, Jan, could you tell us about the situation when you were interviewed? Where did you live, and how did you perceive all the situation of Europe at that time?
Well, I was interviewed in Vienna in a little house that we lived in. I'd been traveling through Eastern Europe more or less the whole time, and I was able to go to visit sort of all of other European countries except for Czechoslovakia, where I was barred from entering it. But I did have a lot of friends still in contact with me, so that I knew more or less what was going on. And I also realized that the whole society was in fact divided in two halves. The one half of the ruling class, and the second, the ruled, in which both more or less sort of played their parts. The rulers allowed the ruled to go through their little swindles and charades, while not interrupting with what was going on. And it was only really when this mutual consensus broke down in 1989 that the system collapsed, because all of a sudden the feedback had just sort of broken down, and the ruled just had enough of what had been going on.
We listened to the situation in Poland and in East Germany and Hungary. You had the opportunity to see the end of communism in all these three countries. Which struck you mostly? was it maybe the rehabilitation of Imre Nagy, or was it the movement of East Germans to the West, or Solidarność movement in Poland?
Well, I think the collapse of communism was it was more or less a sort of a domino effect. I think it had its peaceful moments in, let's say, the Czech Republic, even in East Germany. It had a very, very sort of revolutionary time in Romania, where in fact there was an uprising, really, where even the military at once time sided with the regime, but then switched sides, and that was more or less the moment when the dictator Ceausescu just had to sort of leave. He was then arrested and more or less summarily executed on Christmas Eve.
We still have an opportunity to ask questions, but for Jan Krčmář, who is with us live during this conference. And also I would like to invite again to participate in this panel discussion to invite Jacques Rupnik, the author of the series, to answer not just my question, but the questions of our listeners, of our public. And thank you again for joining us. And I will start with what you mentioned, Jacques, during your speech we heard. You told us that your interviews conducted in Central Europe at the end of the 80s focused on a few related themes, and one of them was the rebirth of civil society and human rights movement. So I'm asking now about this exact moment. Like, I remember that at the time we all thought, like, this is great, we are all united, there is one unified idea which leads us to the connections to the West. But as we see the situation now, it's a bit different. So did you see a big hope in this rebirth of civil society and human rights movement at the end of the 80s?
Well, I think that most of the interlocutors we had a chance to speak to in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, or in East Germany, let alone, I'm leaving aside Romania, that was quite a different situation there. They understood that they were not waiting for an event like 1956 or 1968 because they had the trauma of the defeat of the big either revolution or movement, or even in Poland with Solidarity, the military coup of Jaruzelski. So the idea of the intellectuals, the dissidents, the people who interviewed was that civilization of society was the best way to expand the space of freedom under conditions of communism. The system was decaying. It was economically, its ideology was bankrupt. Nobody actually believed in it. There were very few believers. There were still some practitioners, but very few believers in the communist church. And therefore, the idea was not waiting for the great uprising or the great change, but rather expand that space. And that was the idea of self-organization of civil society. It was on a big scale in Poland, very powerful social movement. The church, of course, provided an umbrella to make such activities possible. In the case of Czechoslovakia, this was more confined, let's say, to the cultural sphere, the samizdat, etc. And the human rights movement, again, was very important, like Charter 77, etc. The idea was you're not asking for the overthrow of the regime, but you them to implement at least the international covenants on human rights that they have themselves signed. They have signed the agreement, and you ask them to implement. And in the Helsinki agreement was a so-called third basket. Yeah, there was one was security, then there was economic interchange, and then third one was human rights or freedom to impart information, freedom of exchange, etc. Well, you ask them to implement what they have signed. That was the approach. And it might seem, in retrospect, to many as small beer, not very radical, anything like that, but it proved to be highly effective. And so that was a state of mind. And in East Germany, I mean, Lutz Rathenau, I remember the interview did with him, and that was exactly the thing. You know, they were meeting in churches where books were being read. People like him would be reading their manuscripts, etc. You had independent activities. There was a peace movement developing in Germany, resisting the militarization imposed by the regime, etc. So these were activities that were not seeking direct political confrontation with the regime, but the self-organization of the society. And then when 1989 came, and that could happen, one has to say, because the center of the empire, the Gorbachev, abandoned the idea of the use of violence. If you don't want to solve problems, if you renounce violence, well, then a lot of things are possible. And once the communist regimes start, you know, backing down from their stronghold, then the space that civil society has created can get bigger and bigger. And as we can see, when free media appear, the regime simply collapses very promptly. But as Mr. said, it was a chain reaction. You know, it was a slow and there was a formula time. You know, Poland, Hungary 10 months, East Germany 10 weeks, Slovakia 10 days. Okay. In a nutshell, the acceleration of history in 1980.
Let me ask Jan Kučmáš, how you see the legacies of that period from the perspective of today. Your dreams and hopes from that time are fulfilled or not?
Well, of course, I have been living in Austria for the last 30 years, so that my perspective of what's going on in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic now is slightly different. But however, talking to friends and on visiting country as frequently as I can, I do have the impression that people are enjoying life much more. They're getting much more of what they had aspired to, even though there are still certain aspects of society where there is still much room for improvement. Especially, I think, as regards human contacts between each other. I think people still have lost their complete faith in trusting their neighbors too much, and I think this is for the coming generation, which has lost all its bits of it's life in a communist country.
You have two questions which link our today perspective with the perspective 30 years ago. And one of the questions is, there are legal leaders in various parts of this world who evidently do not strive for harmony and fraternity, probably missing genes of humanity, who still fascinate great amounts of population that feel disbalanced. Is it appropriate to be optimist? Is a question of one of our listeners, Dana Svobodova from the Czech Republic. Probably she's wishing us harmony. So the question is a bit in contrast with what Jan Kečma said now. Maybe Jacques Rupnik, could you respond briefly?
Oh, well, I'm not the ideal supplier of optimism. You know, the problem with intellectuals is that they usually discuss problems and difficulties and obstacles rather than call for a future. The light was much better at that. You know, I mean, I would refer to the lady who put the question to the speech by Dalai Lama, which preceded us. You know, he's forget materialistic struggles, forget warmongering and conflicts, concentrate on your goal, concentrate on humanity, 7 billion humans. So I will not repeat his speech, but clearly there was a message, an optimistic message, that in the long run we have to come together. I'm less optimistic about today, partly because we live in a world which does not have maybe open conflict. We are not in the midst of a great war. We have lots of local wars, but we have number of new Cold Wars between the United States and China, because he's with in the relationship with Russia, etc. So some of the hopes we had about, you know, the new international order, well, they're not quite materialized, and it's hard to be optimistic, at least in the short run. The only thing that makes me optimistic, at least on a European scale, is that in facing all the difficulties we know about, including the democratic backsliding that is happening in parts of Central Europe, we have this European framework, we have this common project, and whatever else is wrong with it, and each of us can, you know, mention a dozen of things that the European Union is doing, perhaps shouldn't be doing, or maybe useless. But at the end of the day, it has created work where we share same values, same institutions. We have independence and open economies. We are stuck in our COVID situation, but that is not the making of the European Union. That is a global pandemic. And I think none of us believes that we would be better off in dealing with the pandemic without the European Union. So I would say our hope as Europeans is that we have at least created over decades a better understanding, a better a framework within which we can confront the current unfavorable predicament. So that would be my modestly optimistic message. But I'm not the best qualified to provide hope.
As journalists, we are used to describe the situation, but not to put a lot of emotions in it. So my question to Jan, it's a question of somebody who is listening to our panel. How to find stability in this ever-changing world is a bit challenging, but nevertheless, I'm asking you how to find stability in this ever-changing world.
Well, in this case, I am an optimist, because when I see the way my children and my friends' children are coping with or have been coping with, for instance, the COVID pandemic. I think the Czechs have done a very, very good case of solidarity among each other. And I think that they have really sort of, it has brought the country or the people together much closer. And I think that the general atmosphere in the country is much better than it was maybe 2 years ago.
We have some more questions, even if 5 minutes to conclude. So I will try to ask you both again about what our listeners are asking. Question for Jan Krčmář is, what was it like living in Stalinist Prague with a British accent?
Well, it was. I didn't have to speak too much English at the time, but I had problems, of course, with having learned Czech, so that and it was I had sort of problems with my clothing because my mother was able to visit my brother in England, and one of the things that she brought me back in the mid-50s was an original duffel coat, which I wore and which was very much frowned upon by everybody around me. And of course, it didn't help when I was applying for a job that I would be sort of accused of propagating Western standards. But otherwise, the British accent helped when I was translating, of course.
A question to Mr. Rupnik is, were there any interesting discussions about your documentary after it was broadcasted?
They were actually, because it was broadcast at the end of 1988, so this was a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, but nobody, of course, could anticipate such a development. So the main agenda then, in the media at least, and in the public, were developed in the Soviet Union, and that was a Gorbachev moment. So the debate about the film was, you are talking to us in a very critical manner about the communist systems and about the travels of the dissidents, etc. But the real story is Gorbachev, and it's in Moscow, etc. And you are missing the point about the possibility of the reform of the system. So this was the debate that we emphasized in our film, basically the decay and we couldn't say fall, but basically the dead end of the communist system, because previous attempts at reform had been crushed, including particularly in Czechoslovakia. Perhaps the most far-reaching reformist attempt was in Czechoslovakia in 1968, crushed. So when we arrived 20 years after, we thought this was getting a bit late. So the debate was not actually about whether what we were describing was accurate or not, but whether we, focusing on Central Europe and the dissidents, were not giving a bit of a pessimistic view, whereas the real hope was Gorbachev. And it turned out to be the other way around. Gorbachev was facing not just his own demise, but the breakup of the Soviet Union, whereas those who we interviewed, the dissidents, the people who are independent intellectuals, sometimes prosecuted, well, they became prominent figures. Bronislav Geremek became a foreign minister. Václav Havel became president. Of the figures we interviewed within a year were propelled at political center stage. So we didn't anticipate the end, but perhaps we were onto something in saying that the dissident movement in Central Europe was bigger than the number of people involved in it, that it represented some aspirations of the society that, given a chance, would change the politics of the region. And that change came in 1989.
We, in a way, responded to the question where did the leaders found the power for changing the system, even if it didn't or you didn't anticipate that it will happen when you interviewed the figures of opposition and independent culture. The last question I have goes to Jan Krčmář, one of our listeners, our viewers, writes that it was a fascinating time travel dialogues beside the current set ironies. What good that the former former losers can bring to the European table today, besides mentioned curiosity and the will to integrate. What else? Strong women, perhaps in Poland or other countries. So, I mean, we were not mentioning strong women in this dialogue, even if there were some of them in opposition movement. Jan, would you recall some of strong women you remember from the Czechoslovakian time?
I would sort of characterize the position of Czech women was always much stronger than it was in, let's say, Austria. I would say that the Czech women had always carried more or less two jobs and had so very well, and it was if they hadn't, or if they didn't sort of play a prominent role in, let's say, public life, they certainly played a very strong role in domestic life and in creating stability for even, let's say, former dissidents who were able to carry out even sort of their subversive, if we call it that, activities, because they had a very, very strong domestic support.
So we found at least an element of stability in ever-changing world. If I come back to the question of one of the people who listened to us today, let me thank very much to both of you. Thanks very much for your patience in answering my questions. Before I invite everybody who is listening us to the day 2 of this year of our European dialogues, let me thank to the main donor, which is EU. There is an EU grant, Europe for Citizens, which contributed so that this event could happen. Tomorrow from 3 p.m. You can listen to my colleague Jana Zieglerová, who will take over my role as a presenter of the second panel. She is a Prague-based journalist with a diploma from London City University, which a rich experience with the reporting from the US too. As Jacques Rupnik mentioned today, we will have a unique opportunity to listen to the dialogue of 3 generations of Šimečkas, the family of a Slovak dissident, Milan Šimečka Sr., who was one of the interviewees of Jacques Rupnik in the 80s. The panel called Other Europe Today will explore the possible links between the past and present concepts of the Central Europe otherness, let's say, and the perspective of overcoming such divisions. So they will address the current situation. Is there another Europe today? It's a main question which will be explored during tomorrow panel. And we will extend our horizon with the view on Belarus, where the lack of democracy is most significant today. Václav Havel Library called this program Pictures of Other Europe, Belarus. You will listen to the young people and to Václav Havel message, which was pronounced in 2008 and 2009. And it's important, I think, that we will close this year conference with the reminder of a country in Europe where people still cannot discuss as freely as we could today. So the questions which will be explored is sounds a bit provocative. Why should we care about Belarus? You can reflect on the Iron Curtains of today. Is it on the EU border? So I closed with a bit open questions. Thanks for your attention and patience. Have a nice evening.